Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Our group would like to present about credit crisis in 1772. So here we go.
First of all, let me tell you briefly about the background of the crisis of 1772. Before that, what is a credit crash? A credit crash is a form of financial crisis. A financial crisis is any situation where the nominal value of the financial assets drastically drops. A financial crisis may lead to huge panic by the investors in the fear of losing money spent on the assets or the institution. The credit crisis is the economic condition where there is a huge difficulty in getting investment capital from banks and investors. The lenders are reluctant to lend to the borrowers because of the fear of bankruptcy and the default by the borrowers. One credit crisis that occurs in 1772, also known as the Crisis of 1772 or the Panic of 1772 in London. The crash started in London but soon spread throughout Europe. It highly affected Scotland and the Netherlands, and it was also said to cause the feud between Great Britain and the 13 original colonies of the United States of America. In 1770, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which was exacerbated by the action of East India Company, led to massive shortfalls in the expected land values for the company. As the information became public, 30 banks across Europe collapsed. On 8 June 1772, Fordas fled to France to avoid debt repayment, and the resulting collapse of the firm stirred up the panic in London. Economic growth at that period was highly dependent on the use of credit, which was largely based upon people's confidence in the banks. As confidence started ebbing, collapse of the credit system followed. Crowds of people gathered at the banks and request debt repayment in cash or attempt to withdraw their deposits.
Next is reason of credit crisis in 1772. During the decade prior to 1772, Britain made the most of expansions in colonial lands that required significant capital investments across East and West Indies and North America. As commodities like tobacco flowed from colonial lands to Britain, merchandise and basic supply flowed back to colonies. So with the capital scarce in the American colonies, colonial planters were eager to borrow cheap capital from British creditors. So the 1772 crisis is notable for several reasons. Firstly, well-run banks that had not engaged in speculation didn't bear any losses and gained great prestige for their outstanding performance during the crisis. Secondly, it was one of the first times that the Bank of England responded to fears of financial contagion, taking forceful action to intervene directly in the money market and advancing short-term credit to selected banks whose failure might exacerbate the crisis. Thirdly, through its impact was short-lived, the 1772 crisis was one of the earliest purely financial crises, with neither government policy nor European war at its core. Finally, it negatively impacted the relationship between Britain and the American colonies, leading indirectly to the event of the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
My name is Dinah, and I will be presenting about the effect of the crisis. The crisis began to unravel in June 1772 when people began to lose confidence in the ability of banks to protect depositors' savings. In a scene that would be repeated throughout history, everyday people gathered en masse at the front steps of the bank, demanding withdrawal of their deposits. With many banks unable to meet these demands, up to 20 major banks were forced into bankruptcy or at least stopping withdrawals, thus reversing the credit expansion that had driven the real economy in the previous decade. The decline in credit in turn reverberated throughout the real economy, leading to a spike in bankruptcies and a decline in economic activity as the economy sought to correct the excesses uh, brought about by credit expansions. The impact of the collapse was also keenly felt in the US colonies, especially in the South. Before the crisis, London merchants usually granted credit to planters for 12 months to finance the crop. After the outbreak of the crisis, British merchants urgently called for debt repayment, and American planters were faced with the difficult problems of how to repay the debt. As the credit system broke down, bills of exchange were rejected, and almost all heavy gold was sent to Britain. Without access to credit, planters were unable to continue producing and selling their goods.
Okay, Assalamualaikum, I'm Fatin, and I'll be continuing on the effect on the credit crisis. So, among the southern colonies, Virginia planters were the most affected and they had to sell tobacco to cover their debts. However, because the market at that time was extremely low and the prices were cut down so much, they weren't able to earn enough revenue to pay back their debts. Other than that, due to this crisis, the East India Company was also suffering huge losses because they weren't able to pay back their loans that they got from the Bank of England. Therefore, the company decided to sell its 18 million pounds of British tea to the American colonies. Then the company had to sell its tea through middlemen to the American colonies. This made the price higher and the Americans are not interested to buy because they would rather buy the locally produced teas which are way cheaper. However, later the companies were allowed to sell directly through their agents, which will make the price cheaper. Later also, the Tea Act lowers the price of the tea, and this allows the East India Company to maintain its monopoly over the tea trade or local tea trade in the American colonies. However, this causes outrage among the Americans, which leads to the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
After knowing the background reason and also the effect of the credit crisis, now we look at the solution by government. The solution is the Tea Act in 1773, where the British government helped the East India Company recover from its debts. The company was having a huge amount of tea as assets which were lying unsold. The company was earlier just importing the tea to the Britain and letting the wholesaler ship it. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, and the main purpose of the act was to bail out East India Company from its current debts by helping it to sell its unsold tea. It gave the company the right to export and the tea directly to the colonies without paying any regular tax, which were paid by colonial merchants. This made the company able to sell its tea at a lower cost than that of the colonized merchants. This led to the huge uproar in the colonies and led to the boycott of tea and started trying to prevent the company cargoes from reaching the ports of the colonies. On December 16, 1773, some colonies disguised themselves as Mohd India and disturbed the East India Company tea ship by throwing around 342 crates of tea into the harbor. This incident is popularly known as the Boston Tea Party 1773. Similar actions were followed on certain other occasions in the future. This crisis thus led to the worsening of the relationship between the American colonies and the British Empire, and thus led to introduction of controversial legislation against the colonies